So hello and welcome to you all. Thank you for tuning in tonight, and we're very happy to be hosting you again for yet another edition of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I am your host, Andrew de Block, and I'd like to welcome all of our viewers tuning in through Zoom and through Facebook Live tonight. As always, you can communicate with us through the Zoom chat room and ask your questions to the speaker throughout the webinar using the Q&A box or the comment feed on Facebook. Dale will answer these at the end of the webinar when we get around to them. You can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations if you would like to engage with us on social media. And if you missed out on any of our previous webinars, you can watch the recordings on the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel or listen via our new podcast channel on all major podcast streaming services. A big thank you to all of those of you who continue to support the production of these webinars by donating through the Quicket Donations platform. Simply scan the QR code or visit the Conservation Conversations website to find the link to our donations platform. Your contributions help us to keep these talks free for all to learn and enjoy, so thank you for those contributions. Please make sure that you enter our Jacana Media monthly giveaway competition via the Conservation Conversations website. But please remember that this competition is only open to South African-based viewers. We clearly have viewers from all over the world tuned in tonight, but unfortunately this is limited to our South African viewers. We will be announcing September's winner at the end of next week's webinar, so make sure to tune in so you don't miss that. On the 30th of September, you can join BirdLife South Africa as we host the live virtual launch of the next Roberts book in partnership with Jacana Media. Professor Nolene Turner, Temba Ntembu, Sakumuzi Mhlongo, and Junior Gabela, the last three names I read out are all our community bird guides trained through BirdLife South Africa. And those four will share the joinery of creating the first comprehensive guide to the birds of KwaZulu-Natal and their Zulu bird names. I mean, this was an absolutely epic project over many years to pull together. I think it's fantastic that we have our first field guide in one of the African languages. So this promises to be an absolutely fascinating event, and you can register for it through the BirdLife South Africa birding events page on our website, or you can email us on conversations@birdlife.org.za for more details. Next week, one lucky viewer tuned into tonight's webinar will walk away with this exciting Zeiss hamper. All you have to do is stay tuned during tonight's webinar, and one lucky winner will receive this fantastic prize. We will announce the winner at the end of next week's webinar again. So all you need to do is watch tonight's webinar and you will be in the running. Have you ever wanted to explore a Big Five area on two wheels and get to see the Bushveld birds from your bicycle? Well, if that does ring a bell for you, join the BirdLife South Africa team for our annual Cycle in the Bush event at Abelana Game Reserve from the 5th to the 8th of November. Space is limited, so be sure to sign up soon. The price has been reduced to just 13,000 Rand per person, which is a steal for this kind of event. So for more information, please contact Hirel Naik, and her email address is at the bottom of the screen right now. That's hirel.naik@birdlife.org.za. So on to tonight's presentation and our presenter. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my former colleague, Dale Wright, who worked at BirdLife South Africa for a number of years. Dale is a very adventurous man who has traveled over much of southern and eastern Africa and across Africa very broadly. He was the Western Cape Regional Conservation Manager for BirdLife South Africa for a number of years, as I said, and he's going to tell us a little bit about some of that work that he did as part of BirdLife South Africa. We had some really exciting projects down here, especially in the Western Cape where he was based. And in fact, Dale, that's actually where we first met. So I was not yet part of BirdLife South Africa when we first met, but Dale was. And we went out together to go and survey Hottentot buttonquails across the Agulhas Plains. And I see our good friend Wim de Klerk, the good Dr. Wim, is actually in the audience tonight, and we stayed at his place in Struisbaai. And I think, Dale, you've potentially seen the most Hottentot buttonquails of anyone in the world, possibly only exceeded by Alan Lee. And I think I might have the pleasure of being the third person on that list as a result of our fantastic surveys that we did all over that area. I also remember telling Dale at the time I was doing my master's in De Hoek Nature Reserve, not too far from the Agulhas Plains. And I told Dale that one day I wanted his job at BirdLife South Africa, because that was my dream company to work for. And here we are. So old friends nonetheless. Dale left BirdLife a number of years ago, and he got married and went traveling with his now wife, the wonderful Esty. They traveled for 4.5 months all across the East, chasing biodiversity, birds, and also becoming registered yoga teachers in India after a long training course. So as you can see from Dale's hairstyle, he's a very carefree, adventurous, fun-loving man, and he obviously enjoyed that traveling. Since he's returned from that, he's been working at Rhodes, lecturing part-time. He's also been working part-time on a community conservation project with WWF International. And next year, Dale is hoping to land at the University of Melbourne in Australia for a PhD on eco-friendly coffee production in the East and in South America. So again, plenty of fun and travel involved in that. And Dale, I think that would suit you to a T. So tonight, Dale's going to tell us a little bit about some of the adventures and the conservation work that he's done across Africa. And I'm not going to steal his thunder. So Dale, I'm going to hand over to you. If you could share your presentation with us and take it away.
Okay, great, Andrew. Thanks very much. Just checking there. Can you just let me know if that's come up all right on your side?
There we go. We can see your lovely Verreaux's eagle.
Yeah, luckily one of my images. And you hearing me all right, Andrew?
Absolutely, Dale.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. All right, yeah, thanks, Andrew, and all the participants for joining us this evening. It is really exciting to come back and just dip my toes in briefly back into part of the BirdLife family. I was a big part of the family for a very long time, and it's still very close to my heart, BirdLife South Africa. So I'm glad I could have the opportunity and be given the opportunity to join you guys tonight. So yeah, I'll be talking a little bit about some of the conservation projects that I've had the privilege of being involved in over the past 15 years or so. And yeah, it all kind of started with a very humble bird, this one pictured here, the southern masked weaver. And I was about 10 years old when we had a class in primary school where they spoke to us about the garden birds, the Cape Sparrow, the Mossie, and the masked weaver, and the olive thrush at the time. And of course, I got really excited to think that these things had been hiding out in my garden at home without me knowing. And so I went home and started to scope them out. And within a couple of months, my parents found that I had dragged our water polo goals onto the roof of the house and got out an old camera of my dad's and a notebook. And I was furiously documenting the breeding season of the masked weavers that were calling and singing away outside the kitchen door. And yeah, just from that, I guess it sparked an interest and a love for birds within me, and that obviously grew into a broader love for nature and conservation in general. And I was very privileged to then move down to UCT, and of course, studying at the Fitzpatrick Institute, I suddenly found myself being lectured by the very same people who had written all the bird books that I'd grown up paging through for hours on end. And you know, that can seem a bit surreal at the time. And of course, then I was even more privileged later in my life to be able to call those same people, such as Peter Ryan and Phil Hockey, my colleagues, when I was, you know, working with them and discussing conservation issues with our work at BirdLife South Africa. We have such a strong ornithological community in South Africa, so it's really exciting to have been a part of that. And subsequent to leaving UCT, I decided that I needed to get out into the real world for a little while and take a break from academia, and that was what took me across into Tanzania. And I took a job there in what is known as the Moyo-Wosi Malagarasi concession area. And you can see it on the screen circled in red there in the northwest of Tanzania. The area itself is about 12,000 square kilometers. So that's approximately half the size of Kruger National Park, but with obviously far less of the infrastructure. At the time, it would take us about 3 days driving from our head office in Arusha to get across there. In the dry season, a little bit longer in the wet season. And we had very limited camps and infrastructure in the actual reserve. It was a stunning area, and not quite evident from the map, but from this picture here that you can see, Miombo woodland characterized much of the Moyawosi Malagarasi area. But we had a number of different ecotones. So the Miombo woodland would transition into a sort of acacia or borassus palm woodland, very more open savanna-like kind of environment, and then eventually it flowed down through a beautiful grassland and into a massive swamp. And so I was really privileged to have this enormous diversity of habitats. And as the birders on this call will understand, when you have a diversity of habitats, you have a diversity of birds, which was always wonderful for me. Particularly this Miombo woodland, during the migration season would just fill up with racket-tailed rollers and different cuckoo species as they moved down through East Africa on their way south, and the steppe buzzards as well. And I can remember those times very vividly as the birds came back and passed through in big densities, and then suddenly they would be gone again. This is just another view of the beautiful grasslands that we had that characterized much of the southern part of that concession area. And we were fortunate, as I said, to have these various different ecotones and environments. And definitely working out there was the road less traveled. In the wet season in particular, as you can see from the picture in the right-hand corner, the wet season was extremely muddy, and we would almost be restricted to about 40% of the actual size of the reserve. The rest would be inaccessible, really. We might land up in dugout canoes on some of our anti-poaching patrols, or digging vehicles out of the mud. And of course, an adventure always sounds like fun, but when you've been digging vehicles out of the mud for 7 hours in a row, it starts to wear a little thin. So although there's always that romantic idea of working out in the bush, there's the realities that one faces as well. So it's not all smiles and sunsets on the rivers. There's a lot of muddy times that go along with all of that. And part of my responsibility while I managed that concession area in Tanzania was building and running the 4 luxury tented camps and 3 smaller tented camps that we had for our safari guests. This was Malagarasi Camp that was based on the river. It was probably my favorite camp for obvious reasons. Being out on a river just with the bird life was really fantastic. And of course, the opportunity to do some afternoon fishing. We had 5 bull elephants that decided that this particular stretch of the river was the most comfortable, provided the best grazing, and perhaps maybe safety as well, seeing that it was sort of towards where the anti-poaching team hung out rather than out in some of the edges of the reserve. And I remember one afternoon, one of those bull elephants, I had taken a break to do some fishing, obviously at the end of a long day of building camp, and decided that this bull elephant that was walking down the bank suddenly wanted to be right next to where I was, which forced me to retreat into the river, which was normally infested with crocs and hippos. And luckily at the time, none of them were around, and I was able to make a quick escape further up the bank. And when I turned my head around, the bull elephant had, of course, gone back to casually grazing. I'm not sure if this is the exact elephant pictured here, but it was definitely one of that group of 5 that used to spend a lot of time around our camp. And it's just those kind of special experiences that one has out in the bush that definitely make the hardships like contracting malaria multiple times all the more worth it. But in between running the safari camps in the sort of safari season, a lot of my focus was on the conservation responsibilities. And we were very privileged to have a microlight there. And although this is considered to be one of the more dangerous flying crafts out there, we had a very competent pilot, a friend of mine called Paul Ferguson, who would take me out. And although it was beautiful to get up there, this was also a workhorse. So we would use the microlight for scoping out new roads that we maybe wanted to put in. We would often use it for anti-poaching patrols, trying to get the location of new poachers' camps. So we would then radio back down to the teams on the ground. And we would also use it for surveying wildlife as well. And there's some of those photos you saw earlier were actually taken from the microlight. And that was definitely one of the perks of the job, being up there and being able to get above this beautiful wild concession and see it from the air in all its glory. And some of the sort of more conservation-focused work I did, obviously the poaching was a big thing. Unfortunately, Western Tanzania was plagued by ivory poaching in particular. And we did a very big operation where we pulled in a local government and local police, and we managed to gain some intelligence about where poachers were staying after we'd been on one particularly long patrol and had been fortunate to arrest poachers just after they'd shot an elephant. And we used that sting operation to essentially create a temporary amnesty out in some of these villages in Western Tanzania. And what was interesting, we found that a lot of the weapons were coming from refugee camps that were on the border with Burundi and Rwanda, and they were being moved into these villages in Tanzania. And so then some of the villages in Tanzania, obviously these are extremely impoverished people living, right on the poverty line and don't have many recourse to alternatives. And so they get very easily pulled into these kind of activities. And poaching is a far more nuanced thing that I think people often realize. We're very quick to jump on posts on social media about, oh, good, poachers got eaten and such things. But at the end of the day, these are people who are really struggling simply to survive and to feed their families. And they get caught at the bottom end of a very complex and organized criminal syndicates. And really the real people we should be targeting are those further up that chain. Obviously, we have to arrest the individuals who we find in the reserve with semi-automatic weapons or poaching elephant. But at the end of the day, there's some humanity that one must have when we think about poachers and why they're doing it and why they're caught in these kind of situations. And we were fortunate through that amnesty period to actually get a lot of firearms surrendered by these individuals. I think they realized that we'd obviously gotten hold of a network of names. We kind of knew who the poachers were. And so they voluntarily surrendered their weapons and were provided amnesty. And the other thing that's interesting about poaching is that, in these reserves, it takes on a number of different forms. So, of course, the most dangerous was what I showed previously with the ivory poachers and their semi-automatic weapons. But you also have people cutting timber. As you see here, you have people producing charcoal, which is all illegal. It's against the regulations of the reserve. But you obviously treat these kind of people very differently. You would not use the same sort of force when arresting an illegal fisherman or an illegal beekeeper, for example. These are people whose permits have perhaps expired, and we would take them out to town and help educate them about where to get the permits and how long they would be valid for. And so I just would caution you against this kind of militaristic and extremely one-sided view of poaching. In a lot of instances, indigenous people and local communities have had their ways of life proclaimed illegal, and areas that they've been living in and using for many years suddenly proclaimed as protected areas. And so there's sort of some ethical conundrums there that we need to think through very carefully. But of course, one of the important things that we had to do was to be able to offer benefits from the safari concessions back to these communities that live around protected areas, communities that bear a lot of the costs of living with wildlife, but don't always accrue the benefits which some of the private companies and other individuals might accrue. And so we ran a number of community development projects. I worked very closely with my community development field officer, Batra Ngulangwa. He's standing there next to the signboard. And Batra and I designed projects that helped with sanitation, education, and tried to focus on links back to the reserve. We focused on girls' education at a primary school level and health and sanitation in particular. And through those, we were able to generate at least a little bit of benefit back for these extremely rural and very impoverished communities that, like I said, are living on the edges of these reserves. One of the other big projects that I was involved in there that was quite exciting and quite adventurous was cutting a channel through an inaccessible swamp. You might wonder why one does that, and the answers are there on the bottom of the screen. The Sitatunga antelope and the Shoebill stork, which I'm sure many birders listening in might be quite jealous to see. I was very fortunate that when we did this channel, the idea was that there'd been quite poaching in the swamp. We were also concerned that there was actually a syndicate harvesting shoebill eggs for sale on the international market. And so we worked with guys, and I worked with my rangers. When I took that photograph in the left-hand corner, I was also up to my chest in water that day, and was for 2 weeks. I decided that in order to encourage the guys to get this project done, I needed to work alongside them right to the end. And we were able to forge this channel into the swamp, which allowed us boat access, it allowed us our anti-poaching teams access, it allowed us to do surveys of these birds and other animals. And so it really was, although it was an exciting project, it's always got to have that conservation angle. We don't just go cutting through the swamps because we think it's going to be a fun thing to do. And this swamp had really beautiful birds. The bird life, and particularly as it would come towards the end of the dry season, the birds would congregate down in the swamp. You get these big congregations of, as you can see here, the yellow-billed storks, open-billed storks, and glossy ibis in huge numbers. And of course, then when you're paddling silently past a shoebill stork on a nest, there's nothing quite as magical as that in the early morning in the swamps. But yeah, so the conservation work was varied. I did a lot of biodiversity monitoring as well. I contributed towards the Tanzania Bird Atlas project, which a man called Neil Baker was running at the time. I know Neil was very excited to hear that there was a young concession manager who was keen on his birds, and so he was always very appreciative of the data that I sent back to him as well. And that was when I could fit that in amongst managing the concession that at the time had over 100 staff that I was working with in the different camps and anti-poaching teams. But I consider myself very privileged to have had those years out in such a beautiful part of Africa. But of course, after malaria a few times and eating nothing but rice and beans for months on end, and obviously less of the lady friends around for us to run into as a young man of my age at that point of time might have liked, I decided maybe it was time to head back to the city. And so I found myself returning to Cape Town, where I studied a master's in conservation biology. And during that, I actually did some work on the psychology of environmental volunteers. So I asked the Bird Club members, well, why do they contribute to the Bird Atlas project? What motivates them to do so? And I got a little insight into the mind of a birder, I like to think, and that maybe helped me a year later subsequently land a job with BirdLife South Africa. And that was a real privilege to have been given that opportunity. And of course, it was through Mark and my manager, Daniel Marnovic, who provided me with that opportunity. And Mark is probably looking slightly younger in this slide than he might feel today after leading this organization through so many challenges. But of course, he's done an extremely, a completely magnificent job in leading BirdLife South Africa. I know Mark breathes and sleeps the organization, and he takes this goal very much to heart, the goal of conserving our country's bird species, because really when you think about it, that is really what BirdLife South Africa has been working towards, what we were working to, what I was working towards while I was there, and what they are still working towards, and growing as an organization. And it's just fantastic to watch them go from strength to strength, even from the sidelines now. I joined BirdLife South Africa in the Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas program. At the time, the IBA program was globally very well recognized, but unfortunately it had kind of faltered a little bit in South Africa. And so Daniel Marnovic, my manager, was recruiting regional managers such as myself and Nick Turan in KZN and Aaron Stratif, who the birders will be familiar with, up in Gauteng and the Free State. And through this team, we started to re-galvanize the Important Bird and Biodiversity Area program. And so these sites, it's a network of sites across the entire country. As you can see, the full extent of South Africa is covered by just about by these important bird areas. Some well-known sites, the Kruger National Park, the Kalahari Transfrontier Park, the St. Lucia Wetlands. These are areas that are critical for our birds and, of course, for other biodiversity as well. And so we had the privilege of really trying to get conservation work going again in this network. And one of the first things we needed to do was to go out and assess all of these sites to see how they were doing after these many years. I think they were first identified in around 1998. Subsequently, because very little conservation action had happened, we needed to see what had changed and what was going on the ground. And of course, that would also then be important in leading into the kind of conservation work we were hoping to achieve on the ground. And so one of the first things we did were the IBA assessments. And that was essentially a monitoring kind of tool where we looked at what threats were impacting an IBA, what was the state of the habitats and the bird species. So if you declared an IBA to protect certain bird species, are their populations increasing or decreasing? Has the habitat improved in quality? Has this extent of the habitat perhaps increased? And what are the threats that the different IBAs might be facing? And then finally, the conservation action. Who is doing what? Is there a provincial nature reserve in place? Is it a national park? Is there a management plan? And that really is the critical kind of segue for BirdLife South Africa, where we can look and say, okay, so where is there a gap that we can now fill in terms of contributing towards the conservation action at these sites? Of course, though, being a man of adventure, I love the fact that I had to go personally to every site to go and do the assessment. Although some of the work could obviously have happened via some desktop assessments, it was very important that we visited every site. We spent some time bird watching there. We interviewed managers or other stakeholders. Keith Harrison, one of our stalwarts up on the West Coast, and other bird clubs, Anton Odendaal down in the Overberg, our supporters who really helped me learn a lot about BirdLife South Africa and our bird clubs and the IBA network. You know, our local custodians through bird clubs and the bird club members, they play a huge and vital role in monitoring sites, alerting BirdLife South Africa to threats, and they were able to provide me with a huge amount of information about these sites as well. I was extremely privileged to also get to drive around to places like the Cederberg Mountains and up the west coast to our estuaries, along to the Garden Route, as Andrew was mentioning in the intro, all these beautiful places that we have around South Africa as well. But of course, aside from all of the driving around these beautiful places, we had to collate this information. We had to make sure that we were collecting this information in order to inform the conservation action. And so we drafted the Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas Directory, that directory of all of the sites that exist. And then we also produced the status report. And that status report showed us exactly how our IBAs were faring at the time. But going beyond books is always the key issue here. You know, we can't write glossy publications and put them on a shelf and think that we've done our job, because our job is on the ground in conservation and trying to make a difference there. And that was really where the assessments had helped us to identify, okay, so where are these gaps that we can begin filling? And one of the gaps in the Western Cape in particular that jumped out for me was the Western Cape estuaries. And you can see some of the other gaps here. Sorry, I'll come back to the estuaries now. You can see some of our other sort of flagship conservation projects. And some of these which Dr. Melissa Howes-Whitecross might now have inherited in her landscape conservation program. I know that they've been working hard to conserve the grassland areas through biodiversity stewardship and other tools. KwaZulu-Natal with our misspelt grassland, also grassland work and blue swallow work. And then down in the Western Cape, where we focused on the Fynbos Endemics, Hottentot button quail, and our estuary conservation program. One of the things that I realized, as I mentioned quite early on, was that the Western Cape estuaries had seemingly fallen through the cracks in terms of conservation action. Very few of them were declared as part of a protected or a conservation area. And although they had stakeholder committees and stakeholder groups of different government representatives and other civil society members, there was not enough conservation action happening at these sites. And so it was with that in mind that I put a focus of much of my attention in those early years as the regional conservation manager into conserving these estuaries. You know, it wouldn't have made much sense for me to go and double up and try to do work, let's say, in a protected area like the West Coast National Park, where South African National Parks has the mandate. Conservation, we generally have our resources spread thinly. We're not always the most well-funded sector of society, and so we need to be really pragmatic about where we can fill in gaps, how we can partner with other people to get the work done. And so the estuaries were one of our focal points. We were fortunate to have a very successful fleur and flare protected areas project. My project manager there was Samantha Schroeder, who did an excellent job of declaring a protected environment, a 9,000 hectare protected environment above the fleur and flare estuary catchment. And training local community members to be involved in alien vegetation management, fire management, and various other activities. Now, what was important about our approach to conserving the fleur and flare estuary was that we had what you call the catchment to coast approach. So we realized that if we went in and wanted to create a nature reserve around the wetland system but didn't look after its catchment, in a few years' time it might have dried out. Let's say a mine came into the catchment and started using all the water, or agriculture was not managed properly and the water got dried up, then we would have landed up with a kind of bare dust nature reserve down at the flare, which is obviously not worth anything to anybody. And so we started our work in reverse, and we actually protected the catchment first and then worked our way down to the estuary. And so we were able to conserve the Mutantzoq Valley, one of the principal catchments for fleur and flare estuary, through a protected environment. Really great partnership where local landowners, the farmers, contribute part of their properties into a protected area and choose to manage it to the benefit of conservation. What's also important to think about our important bird area work is that although we were conserving birds, we're really focused on habitat conservation at a landscape level. And when you conserve habitats, you conserve various other different components of biodiversity as well. And in this instance, there is an endemic species of flower, the Diastia catalina. It goes nowhere else in the world but that Mutantzoq catchment, and that fell within the protected area which we created. And then you have the fleur and flare redfin, a small species of fish, again, nowhere else in the world but in this catchment. And so these two were two of the kind of non-bird beneficiaries of our conservation efforts up in that part of the world. And subsequently to that work, we were able to employ Dr. Giselle Murison to come on board as our Estuaries Conservation Program Manager. And Giselle, I know, still is working very hard at conserving the Berg River Estuary and the Klein River Estuary, amongst various other sites. And it's great to think that we have left a legacy in the form of the estuary conservation work that BirdLife South Africa is now leading in the Western Cape, and in very good hands with Dr. Giselle Murison. And then coming across to some of the other projects that we did. So with the estuary work and some of the protected area work, I found myself adventuring into lawyers' offices more than I would have imagined, and consulting legislation and various project documents. Not exactly the things that one thinks one is signing up for when one embarks on a career in conservation, but these are all the various different things that contribute to us conserving the natural world. And so our listeners might be familiar with one of my colleagues, Dr. Alan Lee. Now, Dr. Alan Lee, a very good friend of mine, and he was a kind of self-styled adventure biologist, I'll say. When he did his PhD, he surveyed for parrots and other birds in the Amazon jungle. Of course, he had very near misses with jaguars on a couple of occasions. When he came back to South Africa and undertook a postdoctoral project looking at the Fynbos endemic birds and the impacts of climate change, he thought, well, I can't be driving around the Western Cape contributing to climate change while I'm trying to understand its impacts. So instead, he cycled over all of the Cape Fold Mountains, more than 2,000 kilometers. And when I say over, I mean all the way over the mountains. He wasn't happy to obviously survey along the bottom. And Alan collected a lot of critical information about the Fynbos endemics, which up until that point had potentially been a big-sized gap in the ornithological knowledge of South Africa. And on all of these research trips, though, Alan realized that after 2 or 3 years of cycling around the Fynbos and many, many hours of point counts and surveys within the Fynbos, he had hardly laid eyes on this little bird here that you see, the Hottentot buttonquail. Birders at the time would all happily flock off to a place called Arabella near Hermanus and go and tick the 3 or so individuals and go home and add them to the list. But of course, as conservationists, we need to think a little bit deeper. Was that the only population of Hottentot buttonquails? Perhaps not. So we decided that we needed to focus some attention on this bird. And Alan gave me a call and said, Dale, we need a Hottentot buttonquail project. So of course, I did what I do best and started trying to rustle up the funds for us to undertake that work. We were very fortunately supported by Anton Oerendaal, and BirdLife Overberg again came to our rescue with a nice donation. And we secured a few more funds and were able to set off on surveys for this bird. Now, of course, although we were looking for the bird, we wouldn't let the opportunity to have a bit of fun slip us by. And so Alan and I set off, as we like to do, into the back of beyond, in this case, up into the mountains of much of the Fynbos Cape Fold mountain belt, surveying for birds. In these pictures, we were up in the Groot Vadersbos Mountains, the Bosmansbos Wilderness at the very back of Groot Vadersbos. We spent a night or two up there with 2 volunteers who we almost lost in the mist. But fortunately, Dr. Petra Sumaskartner from the Fitzpatrick Institute was very comfortable hiking around the Austrian mountains, was able to relocate us through the mist. And so we didn't lose volunteers in our first ever survey, or we probably would have battled to get more volunteers later on down the line. But yeah, here we were of those surveys. We didn't see any buttonquails this survey. And in fact, we didn't see any buttonquails for many more surveys. You can see here from our study sites around the Western Cape that we traversed a number of areas. And this bird is sort of the size of one's hand. It could probably fit in your hand quite comfortably. And they're very small, and they tend to scuttle through the undergrowth. So they don't fly around. We, at the time, weren't aware of the call. Alan Lee has subsequently been able to capture the call of the Hottentot buttonquail, but at the time we did not really know the call, so we weren't able to use playback or any other type of survey techniques. So the only one we had available was a flush transect. You walk in a line all together through the habitat and hope to flush the bird out. Now, we did that in a number of places, Alan and I, together with a few volunteers. And after about 100 kilometers of walking, I still had not laid eyes on a Hottentot buttonquail. And you can imagine that it's quite an interesting process to have designed a conservation project and begun working towards conserving a bird that you still have not yet seen. But fortunately, all of that changed when we headed out to the Agulhas Plain. And as Andrew intimated, I was very fortunate to have him and to have Riza Nyagera join me on those surveys. I like to think that we showed them such a good time that they decided that BirdLife South Africa was a good place to be employed. And both of them are still with BirdLife South Africa, I'm very happy to say. But yeah, we headed down to the Agulhas Plain, and as Andrew also mentioned, we had our stalwart, Dr. Wim de Klerk of the Agulhas Birding Project, been tracking that area for many years, fantastic information that he's been able to glean of that, which again just shows you the power of a committed individual citizen scientist and how valuable that resource is for organizations like BirdLife South Africa. And very fortunately, Wim took us to one of his kind of guaranteed sites, and there we did our transect line on our first morning, and I was finally able to lay eyes on this cryptic, enigmatic little bird. And yeah, we subsequently went on to do lengthy surveys across parts of the Agulhas Plain, and that is arguably the highest density for these birds. And then you can see here, that's Dr. Alan Lee celebrating in true Alan style in the bottom of the picture, in the bottom of the slide here. And this was when we recorded one up in the Cederberg Mountains. And I think if I remember correctly, the reason we were all so excited was that was the most northern extent of their habitat and potentially the first record for that part of the Cederberg Mountains. So we were very excited. But yeah, we walked many hundreds of kilometers, but fortunately many hundreds of kilometers in good company and through really beautiful areas. Cape Fold Mountains of South Africa and the Agulhas Plains, just such stunning habitats for us to be in. In the end, we covered a total of 96 surveys, 214 kilometers, which I would guess that Alan walked, I think, at least 210 of those. I probably walked about 150 of those. And of course, our stalwart volunteers who joined us on many. Surprisingly enough, we only encountered 34 button quails. But this is where it gets interesting, because we were collecting the environmental data, the habitat association data with every single encounter. We were able to model, or at least Alan was able to model. Not only is he an adventure biologist, but he's also a whiz on statistical modeling, having been trained and worked previously as a computer technician. And so Alan was able to estimate that the population of button quails was in the region of quite a big range, around 45,000 to 70,000, which was far more than we had previously thought. And this shows you the power of research as well, the importance of conservation research, that we were able to suggest that perhaps this bird is not critically endangered or endangered, but maybe vulnerable, and definitely still a vulnerable species. We know very little about this bird's ecology, where they move to, how often they move, because they seem to respond to a very particular habitat type, which accrues about 3 years after a fire has gone through Fynbos. They're a tiny bird. As far as I know, they're a pretty terrible flyer. When we watched them and we did flush them, they didn't go particularly far. And so we don't know how their populations are connected. And we still need to find out quite a lot more to be able to adequately conserve that bird. But for us, at least, we felt that we had at least contributed some more information on the species, and that it was at least looking a little bit safer than what previously was thought to be the case. And so that wrapped up our Hottentot button quail project, and a lot of time spent walking in the mountains. And then I think it was around the end of 2014, we were very fortunate to receive an unencumbered donation from Mrs. Gaynor Rupert. And Mark Anderson then was told that it was to be used for an initiative of Dale's. And so I tried to motivate for a lengthy honeymoon in Southeast Asia, but Mark decided that wasn't the most appropriate use of the funds, which perhaps he was right in making that call. And so instead, Alan and I chatted again about, what could be a kind of contribution to the South African ornithological knowledge and conservation research that was really necessary. And Alan had been thinking about, for some time, the Karoo birds, and in particular the endemic species. A lot of them, the little brown jobs, the LBJs as we refer to them, who for many years have gone not unnoticed in terms of the birding world. These endemics are sought after by birders from around the world, but we really had no idea of population estimates, population sizes, population trends. Are they increasing or decreasing? And that is critical information. When you're setting out on a conservation project, your first point of call is, what is the population of this species, of this plant, of this animal, of this insect? Are they increasing or decreasing? Without that kind of knowledge, you don't know where to invest your conservation resources, where to invest your limited funds. And in South Africa, we have a number of endemics restricted to the Karoo biome, and even the parts of the Karoo biome that stretch into Namibia. So many of them might be considered near endemics. Species like the Ludwig's bustard, Karoo lark, Barlow's lark, the Karoo long-billed lark, many larks across that part of the world, and the red lark as well, a very narrow endemic restricted to the Bushman's Aggeneys red sand dune areas of the northern Karoo, almost on the edge of the kind of Kalahari ecosystem. And so we designed a project that was going to allow us to address these gaps in the conservation and ornithological knowledge. And so our aim was an assessment, essentially, an assessment of what was going on with the birds through being able to map priority areas for them, and also to try and get a handle on, firstly, their range, and then when you're able to estimate the density of a species across its range, then you can start to get an idea of numbers, population sizes, and maybe if you have some historical data, you might have an idea of population trends, but you can also look at population sizes in terms of threat categories, and various different population sizes would qualify or would not qualify the bird as threatened, as we say. And so it can help inform our conservation. Of course, to be able to do that, we need to drive to beautiful places all around the Karoo. And so there's always a little bit of method to our madness, as Ellen and I designed this project, and it required us to do point counts, and that is when we stand for up to 5 minutes or so at a single location, and you record all the birds you see or hear. You also record the distance to the bird, and you use that together with the environmental correlates, the vegetation size, the vegetation type you're in, the rainfall history, the land use, whether you're in a sheep farm or perhaps you're in a national park, and you use those correlates to be able to model the abundance of these birds. But I think the part that Alan and I really enjoyed was that this took us into the real backcountry of the Karoo. I think there were times when we were on portions of farms and sheep farms that the farmers themselves hadn't even visited in many, many years. And there's a special feeling that one gets in these isolated corners of the Karoo, where you really get to reflect and feel connected again to nature and connected to the landscape. And of course, you get to write silly messages on the back of your bakkie so that the farmers don't chase you off their farm with a shotgun. Of course, we would always ask permission before going onto farms, but many of these areas are very isolated, and so neighbors also would be stopping to ask us what we're doing, who we are, why are we walking around with binoculars staring off into the distance. Probably not surprisingly so. We might have looked a little bizarre out there, but we enjoyed it nonetheless. And it was some great time together over those years of surveying beautiful parts like the Campusberg Mountain up near New Bethesda, and just traversing these really wonderful parts of South Africa. But at the end of the day, we needed to justify why we were doing it. Apart from the spiritual reflection that we get from being in the mountains, like I said, we need to have some conservation implications of our work. And what we found, very fortunately, is that overall, the Karoo bird species seem to be stable with very decent abundance and population sizes across a very large area. And so it's also the extent of the Karoo biome allows for these birds to persist. And what was a really great finding for us was that they were persisting on agricultural land, on sheep farms, in almost equal proportion to some of our protected areas and some of our national parks. And so in this instance, the farmers really are a colleague, or one would say a friend of the greenies, the environmentalists, the conservationists. Their vision for the landscape is the same as ours. And we want to avoid mining, we wanted to avoid hydraulic fracturing for natural gas. We wanted to keep the land use as it is at the moment. Of course, that provides jobs. It provides also for the aesthetic of the Karoo. The Karoo is known for that particular aesthetic, and that benefits in turn the birds. And so there's a real opportunity there for conservationists to work with the landowners to conserve these birds. And we drafted a Karoo Birds ecology and conservation booklet as well, which we hoped would try and inform that conservation action. And that brings me to some of the other things that I spent time drafting behind the laptop. Unfortunately, it wasn't all backroad country, mountain hiking and walking and reflection. There were many hours spent in meetings, of course, so I decided not to pull those, of course, into the talk tonight. But here you can see some of the guidelines which we produced while I was at BirdLife South Africa. We worked on waterbird habitat rehabilitation guidelines and how farmers can create their own floating island. We looked in collaboration with Alan. We did the Fynbos Endemic birds guidelines and the Karoo bird guidelines. And then other projects I did was a review of alternative conservation measures for area-based conservation and biodiversity stewardship. All of these reports, these technical guidelines are available on the BirdLife South Africa website. So if you're interested in any of this, you're welcome obviously to go and download that and use these resources. Share them with farmers or people you know that might find them useful. So coming down into one of the last projects I'll talk about with BirdLife South Africa, and this was an adventure of an entirely different kind and an entirely urban kind. You see here the False Bay Nature Reserve IBA, the very well-known Strandfontein sewage works, which always has twitchers flocking down there when a random Palearctic migrant or some species from North America gets lost and somehow finds itself at the tip of Africa. I remember one year in particular, recently, we had about 4 different vagrants, as they call them, that arrived at the Strandfontein sewage works, and really a great place for birding and birds. And we worked with the city of Cape Town here and the Cape Bird Club, in particular Dr. Dave Whitelaw, another stalwart citizen scientist and member of civil society who really helped us in this area, along with the various other volunteers from the Cape Bird Club. And one of the things that was interesting for me at this site was that we got a master's student to work on ethnographic research, trying to understand the local communities that lived around False Bay Nature Reserve and what value they had for the reserve. You know, as conservationists, we protected this area for the birds, threatened vegetation types, an endemic species of butterfly, the Cadestes barbus ranger, that only occurs there. But when we asked the communities living around this reserve what they valued, it was a safe space for recreational activity with family and friends, and a place to reconnect to nature. And so these kind of understandings of the different values that people have in nature, the different values that people have in our protected areas, is critical in our arsenal for lobbying for why we need such spaces, and in particular in urban environments. And so through that work, and one of the projects that we undertook with the City of Cape Town and the Cape Bird Club was to try and expose this reserve a little bit more to those communities who are living neighboring to it, you know, not just have it as a kind of denizen of birders coming from all around the world to look at vagrants. And so in order to do that, we developed the Birdathon event. And this was an adventure in bureaucracy, of course, trying to get the relevant permits that we needed, an adventure in logistics, trying to organize everything. But at the end of the day, it was all worth it when we had 1,000 or so youth, children and their families, and parents and children coming from the surrounding communities into the False Bay Nature Reserve for a day, connecting with nature in a very intimate way, exploring, seeing birds through the scope for the first time there with Peter Newpin, and just really being able to show them those kind of formative nature experiences that I had had as a child and that had led me down this path. And that, I think, as far as I'm aware, this event is still running, and really another one of the great legacies that I was very pleased to be able to leave behind in the Western Cape. That, yeah, who knows, hopefully we get some of our conservationists of the future coming out of these young people who were exposed to birds through one of our birdathon events. And so the final project I'm going to talk about tonight is across in Madagascar, that island that is well known for its endemic diversity, species that occur nowhere else in the world. And I was very fortunate through a chance encounter at an international conference to run into a very like-minded friend and colleague, Dr. John Mittermeier. And together for years, we were scheming up on where we could go on an expedition to look for some rare birds or perhaps even forgotten birds. And we're busy planning another one. But at the time, John had Mahimba Rondro on his sites. And this was also through a collaboration with Dr. Lily Orison at the Peregrine Fund. I was very fortunate to have access to a BirdLife sabbatical, which BirdLife very kindly provides to its staff, where you can take 3 weeks to go and support another conservation organization in their work. And so again, it fell to me to rustle up some funds. And so we were able to generate some money, and we set off up into this magnificent part of northern Madagascar. You'll see here on a map, Antananarivo, the capital, is in the center of Madagascar. Far up in the north is where we were headed to. It was about 3 days of driving to get there until we eventually arrived at the Bemenevica research station managed by the Peregrine Fund. And this driving was over some of the worst, I wouldn't really call them roads, rather than kind of rutted, eroded parts of a hillside, perhaps would be the best description. And this was at the end of the wet season, also perhaps not the best time to be trying to access the site, but we had no choice. And the last day, as you can see in the picture on the left, winching the cars up, and the picture in the top with the angle of the car relative to the angle of the road, we drove, I think it was about 35 kilometers over 10 hours to eventually get to the site. So that just gives you an idea of how long and arduous that particular part of the journey was. But we took it all in our stride, as definitely the areas we were getting to were well worth it. And pictured here is a lake just near Bemenevica. What's interesting about this site, and the reason that this was proclaimed a protected area, and some of you might have read about this in earlier editions of African BirdLife, but Dr. Lily Aronson is the leader of the Peregrine Fund in Madagascar. And Lily one year was doing a survey of the Madagascar marsh harrier, as he's a raptor biologist, and he marked out some wetlands way up in this northwest corner of Madagascar that he'd never been to before. And they'd been driving through those exact same roads I just showed you for hours on end and had not seen hide nor hair of a marsh harrier. And as he was about to turn around, they were stopped on the side of the road, kind of contemplating what to do. And so one soared over the hillside right at eye level with him. And he thought, okay, well, I better go check this out. So he popped over the hill, and he was able to find this really beautiful wetland ecosystem and these volcanic lakes, these volcanic crater lakes up there. And so he surveyed for the marsh harrier, and at the time, working on the Madagascar serpent eagle and red owl, these extremely rare and cryptic forest raptors in Madagascar. And so he decided he needed to get back to survey those forests that you could see in the photograph. And so he came back a few months later. And at the same time as all this was happening, the IUCN, the International Union for Nature Conservation, had officially declared the Madagascar pochard, a small species of brown duck, as extinct in the wild. Of course, it's very sad news, and we all know that extinctions are a reality in the modern world, but no less sad nonetheless. And so Lily then, being his intrepid self, went back up into these mountains, and he walked down, and as his staff were busy setting up camp in those forests that you can see on the left-hand side of that image, Lily took a walk down to the wetland. And there he spotted a flock of Madagascar pochard floating around on the wetland. Of course, they didn't realize they'd been declared extinct, so they were quite happily going about their business. And this is what we call a Lazarus species, Lazarus having risen from the dead. And so Lily rushed back. He told his staff to stop what they were doing because this news couldn't wait. And so they rushed back out on another massive journey back down to Antananarivo to alert the authorities that, in fact, this bird was not extinct. And what followed was a magnificent collaborative effort with the Durrell Wildlife Trust, the World Wetland and Wildfowl Trust, in a captive breeding program. And fortunately, from all the duck breeding that has gone on in the world, we have a very good idea of how you could rescue a duck species from near extinction. So you can see here some images of the captive breeding program. And just now we know that there are ducks swimming around still on that lake at Bemenevica, and they've been re-released to another site as well. So there's hope on the horizon for the species, thanks almost entirely to the very adventurous nature of Dr. Lily Aronson. And these sites are really critical for a number of other threatened Madagascar birds. We have the Madagascar grebe here, the Madagascar rail, and sadly, across much of Madagascar, the wetland habitats in particular have been altered into rice paddies. And this rice is mostly for subsistence. Madagascar produces some of the largest volumes of rice in the world, yet exports very little. So again, these are people trying to survive. And we always need to remember that in conservation, that wherever there's what we as conservationists might call as a threat, there might be an indigenous community that is just trying to survive. And it's how we balance these issues when we're trying to do our conservation. Another denizen of these wetlands, and interestingly enough, I have never laid eyes on a single fluff-tailed species in South Africa, but yet I was somehow able to work with Robin Carlane and see the two fluff-tailed species that occurred in Madagascar. The Madagascar fluff-tail, while we were out surveying in the forest one day, and the slender-billed fluff-tail here. And because obviously, I'm not sure if our readers or our listeners are aware, the white-winged fluff-tail has been a focus of BirdLife South Africa's conservation efforts for many years now. And so one of the ideas that we wanted to do was to collect blood samples for genetic analysis to understand whether the white-winged fluff-tail from South Africa and the slender-billed fluff-tail from Madagascar are closely related. And as it turned out, some of the preliminary genetic work is showing that they are closely related and that they occupy very similar habitats and very similar ecological niches. So there's something interesting here going on in terms of evolution. But what was also very interesting was when we were asked how we would be catching these birds, Lily told us that his field staff would catch them by hand. So for any of our listeners out there, not to worry. These guys are extremely competent bird technicians and ornithological researchers. Many of them have worked with Dr. Lily Aronson since they were young boys. When he sort of spotted one of his colleagues, Eugene Moise, climbing a tree, and he decided that this young guy might be good for ornithological research. And Moise has been with him for 35 years now, and he was the guy that was able to catch these birds literally in the hand. And of course, they treated extremely carefully. We take blood samples, we measure and take other variables and other data, and then we make sure that the bird is comfortable and calm and it gets released again. There are just too few birds of these for us to be taking any chances. And in fact, one of them that was showing signs of stress was released without being processed, just to make sure we were extra careful. And this is another one of those kind of magical, mystical birds that occurs in Madagascar, the Madagascar serpent eagle. Interestingly enough, this bird had essentially been lost to science from the 1950s. There had not been a single record. So having previously been described, it had suddenly disappeared. And now Lily Aronson, being the intrepid and adventurous biologist which he was, decided that he would take on that bird as, I think it was a master's project, just after he joined the Peregrine Fund. And he spent hundreds of hours walking around the forests of Madagascar in particular areas, trying to get sight of the serpent eagle. And obviously his efforts eventually paid off. He was able to track a bird, and he was then even able to record the bizarre behavior of this bird running around on the forest floor hunting chameleons. You know, something that we could never have dreamed of a forest raptor might be doing. Its long talons on the forest floor, running around, catching insects, climbing into the trees and catching chameleons. Just a really incredible bird. We were very fortunate to be able to see this juvenile bird while we were over there. And they put tracking devices on the birds, and so they were able to learn a little bit more about its biology. And this is the man of the hour, the one man that I've been speaking about, Dr. Lily Aronson, perhaps one of the most humble ornithologists and researchers I've ever had the privilege of working with. And there he's standing with the Madagascar red owl. Of course, once again, this bird treated with extreme care. Data was taken, measurements were taken, and it was released unharmed back into its roost where it had been sleeping. And Lily has made it his life's work to conserve these bird species that other ornithologists would perhaps run a mile from. You know, if you're doing research, surely you want to do research on something you can see on a regular basis. Not Lily. He's more comfortable researching stuff that you might not lay eyes on for months on end. Kind of reminds me of our Hottentot button quail work. But nonetheless, he's done amazing things in Madagascar in terms of establishing protected areas, working with government, working with communities when designing protected areas. And so Lily had called on John and myself and said, the Mahimbarondra protected area up near the site where the Madagascar pochard was discovered is this big block of forest that has never been surveyed. And he said, you know, we need to get a team in there so we can look at the birds and the other biodiversity that occurs in the site. And we were very privileged to then lead that team. John and myself managed to get a herpetologist on board, Lou Kemp, and 2 entomologists from Belgium, Dr. Merlin Jacques, and another colleague of ours who joined us in these forests. And so they were surveying all sorts of biodiversity while we were surveying the birds over a couple of days. And now again, that might sound like a lot of fun, and sure it is, but it's definitely for a particular kind of person. So if you can imagine yourself feeling comfortable with having wet feet and muddy socks for 3 weeks in a row, sleeping in the damp without any of your clothes drying, and eating rice and beans in the kitchen and dining room that you could see on the top left for weeks on end, then you would be fine and you would have joined us quite happily. If none of those things sounded that enticing, then you might have had a mental breakdown. And unfortunately, some of us almost did. As it turned out, we'd been kind of crying ourselves to sleep in our tents at night, but then putting on brave faces as we headed out in the morning to go and do our biological research. But nonetheless, we really loved being in such an incredible, untouched rainforest. You know, it's almost something that one dreams of as a young biologist, to be able to go out into a remote, unexplored rainforest and spend time documenting its biodiversity. And we were very fortunate to do that. Birds such as this rufous ground roller, just one of the magnificent species that we encountered while we were out there. And the little encetes, these very small ascites, these very small sunbird-like birds that flitted around the forest all around us the whole time. And here is my colleague, Dr. John Mittermeier. He's collecting acoustic recordings that we did in the forest when we went out on our bird point counts. So research on the left there. And then, of course, the joys of fieldwork there is removing a land leech on the right. Again, if you weren't comfortable with leeches, you might have not been that comfortable in this particular forest. But all in all, just part of the job, I guess, for us being out there. And Madagascar has really incredible biodiversity. The chameleons and the other reptiles and amphibians are some of the most remarkable groups that one gets there. Huge numbers of endemics. We were fortunate to have a herpetologist on board. Now, this is the Parsons chameleon. It's the largest chameleon in the world. This was not one of the ones. Oh no, we did actually. Sorry, correct myself. We did find this species up in Mahembe-Rondro, along with many others. And our herpetologist has since told us he might have new species that he's busy in the process of describing. He also definitely had range extensions and altitudinal extensions for various different amphibians and other reptiles from the Mahembe-Rondro forest. So just fantastic to be able to contribute that data on the area. And one of the very interesting things was that our moth expert, Daan Slootmakers, a Belgian, who is also working in conservation and in the environmental, one of the government departments over in Belgium. He was using a technique known as light trapping. And so essentially you hang this white sheet up in the forest at night with a bright light, and you have moths from all over the forest just congregating on this sheet. And in one time he told me that on this, I think it was this particular sheet we were looking at, that there were easily over 100 species that he was looking at. So just incredible diversity and really interesting to learn about the different techniques that the other researchers were using as well. Here's just a small sort of sample of that moth diversity, these creatures that really look like they come from another planet, just absolutely stunning organisms. And yeah, we were very privileged to spend that time in Mahembe-Rondro, and all of our findings have gone back to Lily. And Lily and his team have actually used the trail that we were able to create. We had a team of local villagers who joined us. We hired them to help cut a trail into this forest to actually be able to access the site and set up our camp. And because of that, Lily's been able to now go back there. We do more research there. It's helped improve the conservation efforts in the region, and it's contributed to the management plan as well. And of course, contributed to science, contributed to our knowledge of the biodiversity of that area. Through our bird work, John and I were able to show range extensions for a number of birds, altitudinal extensions for a number of the forest birds of Madagascar. So all of this information is really critical when one is doing conservation. But of course, at the end of the day, there's also a lot of fun that we have while we're doing it. And yeah, so as Andrew mentioned, that's it from me. And I'm hoping that my next adventure will be similar to my last. This was taken in the Danum Valley rainforest in Borneo, the beautiful hornbill species that one gets there, where I was privileged to travel around last year for play. There wasn't much work involved, although my wife might disagree, having been forced AM on regular occasions on our sabbatical to go looking for weird and wonderful creatures. And hopefully now through our next trip down to Australia and working on biodiversity friendly coffee, I will still be able to go on adventures, but more importantly, be able to make a contribution towards the conservation of birds and other biodiversity. So that's it from me this evening. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dale. It was really incredible to see the pioneering wild field work that you've been able to put yourself through, for choice of expression. You've been able to do some of the kinds of work that I think a lot of us that get into biology and conservation kind of dream of doing. So I'm very envious of some of your experiences. But as you said, adventure comes with some sacrifices, sacrificing a few luxuries. Rice and beans came up a couple of times. Wet, damp feet and sleeping in the soil. Also, I don't know if I would have been cut out for that, but I bet you wouldn't take any of it back to the world. So it's also super encouraging from my perspective that you always keep local communities involved in the work that you do. That's so important for modern conservation, whether those are rural Tanzanians or Karoo farmers or rural Madagascan communities or in your upcoming PhD, hopefully Indonesian and Brazilian coffee producers. So thanks for sharing your conservation adventures with us. I loved your description of Alan as an adventure biologist. I think you also fit that description to a T. And we wish you all the best with the adventures that still await you, not least in Australia, Southeast Asia, and South America. So we'll get to some questions just now. I just want to thank everyone who tuned in tonight for joining us for another episode of Conservation Conversations. Before we do take those questions, a reminder to everyone to please participate in the post-webinar survey, which should pop up when you exit the webinar after this question session. Do pop your Q&A, your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom. Alternatively, if you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can pop those in the comments as well, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before 8 o'clock. By my watch, we have about 25 minutes, so that's a good amount of time to drill Dale on all the different issues he touched on. Next week, we welcome to your screens Dr. Melissa Lewis, BirdLife South Africa's Policy and Advocacy Program Manager. Melissa will be sharing some of the incredible work that she's been involved with at the highest level of conservation policy development to assist our migratory birds along the East Atlantic Flyway and between Europe and Africa. So be sure to tune in for another riveting talk. I think Melissa has been a very impressive appointment in the 4 or 5 months that she's been with BirdLife South Africa, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about the amazing work that she's already done, especially as part of the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement. And I'm sure Dale, having done some wader surveys along the coast, the Palearctic waders, and seen the declines in that, I'm sure you're also interested in hearing what Melissa has to say on that. So as I said, if you have any questions for Dale, these can be typed into the Zoom Q&A box or the Facebook Live comment feed. And we're going to start off with some of those questions. Dale, if you are ready.
Yeah, sure, Andrew.
So there's just a couple here for now. I'm sure we'll get some more in now. Penny Abbott typed this one in at just after you finished your section on Tanzania. And this might be more of a PhD thesis, but if you could put it into a few sentences. Dale, what do you think might be some of the solutions to illegal timber harvesting and the resultant deforestation across sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, sure. It's a big question. Just thinking off the top of my head, one of the projects that we did while I was there was fuel efficient stoves. So it's a small one, and I know a lot of NGOs and charities have tried that across Africa, trying to be able to get people to basically burn fuel more efficiently when they're cooking. But I think, perhaps solar power might be able to fill that gap. And increasingly, we look to technology to try and solve these problems. If that's for cooking, would perhaps people don't have access to electricity, but if we can create electricity through not large-scale solar, but small-scale solar installations on individual houses out in those rural areas, maybe we could try and come up with that solution to heating and cooking that people are really looking to the Miombo woodlands to provide for.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, solar has become so much cheaper in the last 10 years. It's becoming more accessible, and I know there are projects to install those kinds of things across Africa. It just needs to be ramped up, I guess. And I think there's probably also an education aspect in that as well, about getting people to understand why it's important to conserve woodlands and forests and savannas and all of that. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, exactly. I know a lot of people also started to plant their own woodlots. So that was also something that people were doing, actually plant a series of trees that they can harvest from, and in particular those trees that coppice very quickly, that will respond to cutting back. So that was one of the projects that we were trying to work on as well. And planting in the sort of periphery of the reserve, so that you can keep some Yombo woodlands intact and then have some that are hopefully being sustainably utilized.
Yeah, awesome. Tom Davies wants to know a little bit more about your upcoming potential PhD. He asked, would you be willing to share some details on your pending PhD in sustainable coffee? And also, what inspired you to study away from bird conservation?
Okay, yeah. So I guess I've been interested in various aspects of conservation for a very long time. So I was never potentially going to be going and doing a focused kind of ornithological work sort of PhD. And in fact, a lot of my conservation work, as you saw from the Tanzania and the BirdLife stuff, was not always related to the ornithological aspect. But yeah, so essentially the Sustainable Coffee Project, looking at biodiversity friendly coffee, we're going to be doing a full supply chain sustainability analysis. And so we're going to be looking at, I'll be working with small scale growers to understand the challenges and opportunities that they might be faced with to be able to transition to biodiversity friendly coffee. Now, what's interesting about this is that biodiversity friendly coffee is often shade grown coffee. So we have coffee that's grown in full sun, in kind of monocrops, as you would see in traditional agriculture, commercial agriculture. But then we also have these traditional ways of farming coffee, which is under these big old growth tropical trees. And there's people that argue that the shade grown coffee actually provides a better flavor and maybe higher quality coffee. At the same time, that shade grown coffee provides habitat for all sorts of birds and biodiversity. And so essentially, if I can be working with small scale growers to understand those opportunities to help them to move or transition to that kind of agriculture, we're creating habitat for birds. And so, inadvertently, I'm conserving birds again, kind of in a roundabout way. And at the same time, I'm going to be working with suppliers, coffee buyers, to understand their challenges and constraints in terms of biodiversity friendly coffee. How can they support the growers, and how can we create those markets? And then I'll have another colleague, a postdoctoral researcher, who will be working with consumers and going into coffee shops and trying different messaging to understand, okay, well, what might persuade somebody to buy the bird-friendly coffee or the biodiversity-friendly coffee? And so in that way, we'll be doing this kind of full product life cycle sustainability research. And what I really like about this PhD is that we'll be working with the growers on the ground and feeding that information back to buyers and suppliers. Genovese Coffee, the group that we'll hopefully be working with, or is already on board as a project partner, is very keen to develop their own certification. And so what I like is that this is applied research. I really feel that a lot of conservation science by definition should be applied. And I'll be glad that hopefully the PhD doesn't just land up in file 13.
Yeah, fantastic. I think there's common themes through a lot of your work in terms of adventure, communities, birds, stewardship. I'm sure you're going to take some lessons learned from the Western Cape lawyers' offices forward with you. So it wasn't all wasted dead time. Jürgen's commented here, it seems like we're losing a really passionate conservation to South Africa. Great presentation, by the way. So I'm glad we're not losing you to birds entirely, although we will be losing you to South Africa for now. I think South Africa will probably always be home. So that's
exactly
great.
And we can hopefully bring some of the knowledge and the education that we gain and apply it back to the conservation problems in Africa. We're definitely not running for the hills at the moment.
Cool. And you mentioned catching malaria a few times in Tanzania and leeches and all in Madagascar. Shasi Kassan wants to know, what other health threats did you encounter in your research travels? What precautions did you have to take before going to all these far-flung destinations? So some more info on some of the nasty parts of the exciting adventures.
Yeah, sure. So, because I was working in Tanzania permanently for many years, I couldn't be on the malaria prophylactics because they're very bad for your liver. And so there you just have to be careful. You cover up your legs and arms at night and you use mosquito repellent. But yeah, there are times when you're out on anti-poaching patrol and you get caught out in the nights and you're out there and then you invariably get bitten. And in the end, I unfortunately got a recurring strain of malaria that came back 3 months in a row, and then subsequently caught it again twice. So I had malaria 5 times while I was in Tanzania. And yeah, I was also always tested myself. Every time basically I would come home from being in Tanzania, because I was working in the swamps and in the bush, I would go and get tested for bilharzia to make sure I wasn't carrying that parasite, I think it is. And yeah, when we went to Madagascar, because it was only 3 weeks, we were able to take the malaria prophylactics. And so obviously if you're doing these shorter expeditions, then you can take those things. And you obviously get vaccinated against yellow fever and typhoid and anything else that you can catch out there. Although the water that we were drinking coming out of the streams is crystal clear, you can still catch some nasty bugs. So you just have to be careful, I guess.
Brilliant. Sarah Charlton has more of a comment, but maybe you can speak a bit more to the issues. She says, fantastic and inspiring presentation. Thanks so much, Dale. Thanks for the balanced view on poaching. Behind that is the complex story of capitalism, who become the haves and the have-nots, a bigger and very difficult set of networks and relationships. I don't know if you want to just speak a bit to your experiences of anti-poaching a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I think that's something that definitely sits with me quite heavily. That difference, the haves and the have-nots, as she alluded to, and this idea it's very easy for us to sit very comfortably in our houses with all of our resources and judge people who have far less than us for their choices that they're forced to make. And yeah, I think that speaks a lot. I have the philosophical discussions with friends and with family regarding capitalism and a neoliberal market system very often. I think one of the important things for us to realize is that it's resource use on an individual level that is really the impact. You often hear people saying, oh, population growth, it's people having numbers of children, but it's simply not true. The average American, for example, with their lifestyle uses far more resources than the average African. The average American family uses far more than the African family, even if they only have 2 children versus 8. So that population question is just not quite accurate. And one thing that is important for us to then consider is how can we as individuals reduce our resource use? When can we switch off lights? When can we cut electricity? Can we switch to solar? Can we harvest our own rainwater? Can we cut down on meat and eat a healthier diet that also is healthier for the planet at the same time? So what can the haves do to reduce their environmental footprint? And I think we can always look to ourselves first to try and make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, you raised some excellent points. And just on the poaching element, I think I have a lot of sympathy for the guys that tend to be villainized or vilified by the so-called keyboard warriors, or as you say, kind of the regular people like us sitting with all of the resources and waving our finger at the people who go and take down an elephant or a rhino. I have a lot of sympathy for them that they came from desperate circumstances and maybe don't have other economic considerations. That doesn't mean I agree with their actions, but where I certainly have less sympathy are the syndicates and the criminal groups that run these and make the money off it. Yeah, I think that's probably where a lot of the effort really needs to be spent. Number one, community education in those areas, but if you don't give them alternatives, it's very difficult. If you don't give them alternatives and also deal with the demand at the source and the criminal elements to it, then it's a very difficult battle to win.
Yeah, and I know a lot of work is going into demand side management, particularly in Asia, trying to change cultural perceptions around some of these things, and a lot of work is going into trying to unravel these criminal syndicates. Sadly, that also often lands in deaths and in murders and things as well, because we're talking very big money in many of these poaching rings and organized criminal factions, whether they're linked to various other nefarious activities like running arms, etc. So yeah, it's some very dangerous and bad people that you're dealing with on that side of the equation.
Yeah, as opposed to, I guess, bushmeat poaching, which is a different issue entirely. Okay, moving on to something perhaps more optimistic. Marilyn Aitken has posed the question, do you feel hopeful about the future for biodiversity in Africa as a whole? Of course, you've traveled and worked fairly broadly across the continent. And if you do, what are some of the hopeful signs that you've seen?
Yeah, I think, being an optimist, although I like to think of myself as an optimistic realist or a realistic optimist. I don't want to have my head in the sand or up in the clouds, but I am hopeful for the future of conservation in Africa, simply because, I'm one of, and we as BirdLife South Africa are one of an army of people who are fighting for the conservation of our biodiversity. And we're getting smarter in how we do things. At first we're creating a lot of protected areas that shut local people out and created a lot of social injustice. But then through the community-based conservation work, that got turned around. And so we're doing a lot of work to support local communities, to support development alongside conservation. And if you just think, words such as sustainability didn't exist in the public lexicon maybe 30 or 40 years ago. So there's a huge global swelling of awareness, particularly in the resource users, like I was saying, the intensive resource use areas like Europe and America that are becoming aware of this stuff. And hopefully that trickles down into impacts for crops and other things. Often the impacts from America are displaced to other areas, of Europe are displaced to other areas. The palm oil problem is a displaced problem where palm oil is grown for consumption elsewhere. And so hopefully there's that to be optimistic about. And then I think we can be optimistic about conservationists' ability to come up with solutions, to collaborate. In particular, now we're seeing a move to incorporating traditional ecological knowledge, local ecological knowledge, working with people who have lived alongside wildlife for generations, thousands of years, and trying to understand how they've been able to do that. We're now incorporating that into our conservation solutions. So we're always innovating. And so I think we also have to remain optimistic. We can never get too pessimistic, even though we get thrown with challenges. And I know you do see in conservationists sometimes the kind of existential crisis that one sits in when one feels, as an individual, how much can I possibly do? And also as a conservationist, you're aware of how big these challenges and these problems are. But at the end of the day, it sometimes then helps to shift, to fight one battle for a while, like I did in Tanzania, and then to say, okay, now I'm going to hand the baton to somebody else, and I'm going to go get energized to fight a new battle. And I think that's part of the movements I've made in my career as well, to maintain that energy and maintain that enthusiasm. Not to say that we're running from a problem, but to say, I've done what I can for this problem. I'm not going to hand it over to someone else, Giselle Murison, yourself, Melissa, Howes Whitecross, to take on that baton and continue to fight those challenges while we go and fight battles elsewhere. And yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we can feel hopeful and helpful, and we need to be. It doesn't help if we're pessimistic. We need to envision the future that we want, and we need to be hopeful about that future in order for us to get there. And so I hope that people around the world will think in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. And I think sometimes we get so bogged down in the negative news, because that's usually what makes the headlines. That's usually what gets reported. And we're not necessarily that good at communicating our successes. So I know BirdLife South Africa in particular has deliberately taken a strategic move to report successes as widely as we can and keep our messaging positive, because that will encourage more participation, it will encourage more action. And at the end of the day, as you say, there's no need to get pessimistic. It's probably unproductive and anti what we want to achieve. So I think that was a really nice answer. Thanks for dealing with that. Alistair Stalker would like to know, or he comments first, that we cycled through southern Madagascar 4 years ago, and it was very depressing to see the number of Chinese who were involved in logging the rainforests. is this a problem up in the northwest as well?
Yes, so I think the parts that we were in were just too isolated yet for any logging to be getting in there. So we were fortunate to not see any of that. We were thinking we might come across it. It is a protected complex as well. But yeah, I do know that is a problem in other parts of Madagascar as well, sadly.
Great. So there's just one more comment from the audience here, but I want to ask you a question first. There's been quite a groundswell of movements worldwide, not only in South Africa, but particularly in the US actually, to change birds' names, which are offensive. And some of these include, or the popular example that people give in the US is McCowan's Longspur. McCowan was a racist general in one of the Civil War armies, and was a just historically very bad person, despite his place in history and his military successes. So that Longspur's actually had its name changed this year. And I wondered if in your engagements around Hottentot button quail, whether you'd kind of come up against any questions around that bird's name, and if you had any thoughts or comments.
No, I hadn't. I hadn't actually considered that one. I've been reading similar stories around some of the ornithological stalwarts, particularly in America, who were, like you say, not great people, and perhaps some of the ornithological sort of early pioneers that came out to Southern Africa were in a similar sort of vein. And I think it is critical at this time when we're thinking about addressing social injustices on a massive scale that we not be afraid of having those conversations and addressing things when they need to be. So yeah, as far as the button quail is concerned, I hadn't considered it, but well, maybe that would be something for South Africa to think about.
Yeah, there's been a suggestion or put forward that we perhaps consider calling it the Fynbos button quail, as opposed to the black-rumped and common button quail that we get up north. Would that be a suitable name, do you think?
Yeah, I think Fynbos button quail would suit it quite nicely, and it would be really nice to have one of those Fynbos endemics actually carrying Fynbos in its name. So yeah, if we can address social injustice and have a positive outcome like that together, then that's really fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, the last question then for you, Dale, comes from Eleanor Mary Cadle. She's also one of the stalwarts of these webinars, and I don't think has missed one yet. And she always manages to contribute at least one question. So here's Eleanor's question for this week. I think it is somewhere in Spain that landowners are growing crops and grazing animals among forests of oak trees. Could there be some crop apart from shade-loving coffee, perhaps, that might be grown in these conditions in Africa?
Yeah, I'm not sure if something like any of the nuts perhaps might work in those kind of conditions. Peanuts, for example, perhaps cocoa and chocolate as well. I know there can be terrible deforestation to plant chocolate. So I haven't done a lot of research into what might the other sort of shade-grown products might be. The PhD is kicking off in January, so I still need to get into that literature. But thanks for that. That's definitely something to consider. What are the other opportunities, and how could small-scale growers diversify their products as well?
Yeah, perhaps once you are 6 months to a year into the PhD and got some further insights on all of this from different places around the world, we can invite you back to give another presentation. I think it would be fascinating to hear about the different biodiversity related actions that are taking place in the coffee industry. Certainly something we haven't covered, or it's not something that we think about too often down here in South Africa, despite having quite a coffee culture, I think, especially down in Cape Town anyway, where I'm based and you spent a lot of time. So yeah, Dale, that is it from us tonight. I just want to again say thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your amazing presentation. I think your images were fantastic. You had some lovely stories in there, and some time spent with some wonderful people that you acknowledged in the presentation. So thank you for that, and thank you to everyone that tuned in. We hope you have a wonderful evening ahead, and stay happy and stay safe. Good night.
Yeah.